So the first few things I'm going to talk about are kind of soil texture and soil properties, how to evaluate your soil, and all the different kind of ways that you can look at your soil to understand what's happening and what impacts you might have had on it, and then some different practices or ways to manage your practices in soil such that you can reduce those impacts. By the way, Andrew, do you want me on that side?
Doesn't matter, right?
Okay.
As long as you stay with
Okay.
one spot.
And then at the end, we've got some soil samples over here. Those are just taken today as an example. So we've got one from a cornfield with no cover crop, one with a cornfield with a cover crop, and then a grass field. And the grass and corn are actually the same soil type, and you can see what the difference is when you grow one crop or the other on the overall soil benefits and textures and properties, etc. So some interesting kind of hands-on, and as I go through, we'll talk about some of those properties, and you can kind of come and check those out and play with them afterward. Or during. I mean, feel free to get up and go check them out as we're talking about this if you want to kind of get a hands-on and understand that. They're really, really heavy, otherwise I'd pass them around, but they're a little cumbersome otherwise. So just to set the soil, or set the stage, if you will, set the soil, soil quality is probably one of the most important things on your operation. And that is because it dictates so many of the benefits and the economics of your entire dairy operation in so many ways. So it's an economic benefit from what do you do to your soil and what does it return back to you. There's a lot of things you can change to get better yields for better economics, less work on your field for better economics, different crop rotations, different feed qualities for your cattle, which leads to better milk production, etc. Everything about your soil will eventually come back and affect positively or negatively your economic balance on your farm. It's an amazing, and seems like something that's easy to ignore, but it's something if you give it a little attention and you understand it, you can increase everything beneficial about your farming practices overall. So obviously crop production and yields, the better your soil quality, the better your yields are going to be, and that affects your crop rotation as well. So what most folks are grass and corn, maybe a cover crop in there, and I'll talk about that a little bit more about what are the benefits of having one or the other, or dedicating some fields to a more longevity for maturity of your forage fields and what that can look like and how that can change things. So that's going to affect those pieces. The nutrient value of your feed, this is a huge driver in your soil. Whatever your soil nutrient availability is, that's what's available for your feed, that's what's going to be taken up, and then you harvest it. So not only does your timing of things like manure application affect that, but your soil quality affects when those nutrients and how much are going to be available. So that can have a big influence and big factor. And that, of course, affects animal health. So your feed quality directly relates to your animal health. If your nitrates are too high in your feed, for instance, your potassium is too high, all those pieces, you're going to negatively affect your animal's health, which is if you have really good soil quality, if you have a grazing operation and you can really increase that soil health, you increase forage production, that's less feed you have to provide as a supplement, better grass quality, better for your animals overall. So you really get an animal health positive interaction there. And then nutrient losses to surface and groundwater. When you have a really nice healthy soil profile, you're going to have less runoff issues, less leaching issues when your crop is vigorous in there. So you can directly affect those just by changing some of your practices and increasing your soil health and quality. So we'll kind of go over each one of those. The first thing, just to set the stage, is that the texture and physical properties are determined by your soil type. So every one of your soil types is some combination of sand, silt, and clay. And this is a great kind of diagram of that. That somewhere in here, your soil type on any one of your fields is going to lie. And it's really going to depend on, the percentage of clay to sand to silt and where that's going to lie. And this, you can see these numbers are percentage as you go down and over. And so you can kind of figure it out. And this, the graph here that you've got, that table determining texture by feel and flow. So that's one way. I mean, you can just look at your dairy plan map and your soils are likely on there. But nonetheless, if you're very curious, you want to go out and figure that out, this is a great table to help you kind of figure that out. Where is it feeling, etc. So I've got another little assessment about that as well. Another slide as well. But That's going to dictate a lot. So knowing what those three components are going to help you understand your soil tremendously. Everything we talk about from here on out, you need to know this part first so you understand what your starting point is for that soil type. So the soil texture, that's going to dictate how easily water flows through it. So from sand to clay, sand obviously is going to have the largest particle sizes, so you have the largest pore spaces, so water is going to have the best infiltration rate, versus when we move to clay, very small particles. They like to all group really tight, so your infiltration rate, permeability is going to be less. How much water it retains, you want to flip that. So clay is actually going to retain far more water. It's like a tight sponge, whereas sand, if you think about it, just runs right through, so you're not going to have that water retention. How well plants will grow, usually silt is the best because it's not compacted or really tight and waterlogged, and neither is it really loose and drained. So these silt types usually have the best plant growth, the best kind of nutrient availabilities. And a lot of our soils fall in that kind of silt range. And when you look back here at this chart, you can see that clay actually takes a big chunk of a lot of soils. And these are kind of all your silty type of soils over here. So it's kind of a balance of that. And then how susceptible is compaction? Clay is the easiest susceptibility to compaction, and then sand is the least. And again, if you think about the particle sizes of that, and obviously if you have any of these soil types on your farm, you probably already know this because you've seen some of the indicators of compaction and poor soil health in one or more of these soil types. And we'll, as I said, we'll kind of go over each one of those, but clay definitely is the most compaction because it's very susceptible for those small particles to kind of bind together. And you can see that in some of these soils that we've got collected over here. So the first thing is in determining that soil texture. Here's another table and how you would do that. And you can see it's got a little picture on that for determining that. But essentially you just wet it in your hand and then you kind of roll. You kind of squeeze it and roll it in your thumb and forefinger. And the longer that ribbon, the higher the percentage of clay. It's going to stick together. Sand, obviously, is just going to fall apart. And kind of a silty type of soil is going to be somewhere in the middle. So you can really, this chart is a very nice way to kind of figure that out. It gives really nice descriptors. This one does the same. So it's pretty much very similar on kind of looking at that. And then for estimating soil moisture, you can do these two things at the same time. It's going to be a really similar process. I guess let's slide away. But on the other side of that paper, you'll see it's a very similar process in feeling if it's dry and wet or slimy, etc. So those two things are pretty easy to do at the same time. So some of the benefits of knowing what your soil texture is, once you figure that out, is that there's a lot on this table, and I'm going to point out a few things, but the properties or behaviors that we find desirable or interesting or notable about our soils, such as its water holding capacity, which is essentially, you want to know that for your plants, or you're going to have to irrigate, and what does that look like, how often. Knowing that water holding capacity is going to help you understand that better, which fields you need to manage a little more thoroughly for that practices. Aeration or permeability and infiltration or drainage rate. So these two things are pretty connected, and it's basically how well can soil get in the top of that profile and then get all the way through, or excuse me, how well can water get through there, or what is its runoff potential going to be. So those are some, probably people care about these the most around this time of year. How early can you get out on that field for manure application? What is your loss going to be for sediment and nutrients off the surface for runoff losses? Those are really important things. Your soil organic matter, most of our soils around here are pretty darn high because we've had historical manure application on them, which really increases that. And that's a really positive thing. Having a good organic matter in there really improves all the properties of your soil. So that's a really good thing. And then your warm up in spring, compactability is a really important one as well. This tells us, you know, how gingered you need to be on that field for its compactability. And then some of the other ones as far as suitability for tillage after rain, ability to store plant nutrients. And when you look at the sand, silt, and clay partitions, you can see that each one of these is a little bit better or worse at some of these. And so knowing what's important, knowing what to manage for these different things is going to be really important. So when you say, okay, I've got a really like silty clay type of soil, and you can kind of look at what are its biggest constraints, what are my biggest benefits on there. So obviously you're going to have very poor permeability, and infiltration is going to be very slow. So you're going to really have to manage for those types of things for what you do on that soil type. Whereas your water holding capacity is very high, and your ability to store plant nutrients is also really high. So looking at those qualities, and so when you pick what crop goes on what type of soil, you can look at these things and it'll help you work that a little bit better. So, and as I mentioned, kind of the three that we are most concerned about from, I guess, an environmental perspective when we think about runoff and infiltration rate, but also from your crop's health perspective. So how well is water going to drain out of that field? You're going to have waterlogging issues in there. You're going to have ponding and standing water issues and root rot. How well is that water holding capacity? How soon is it going to reach saturation? When can you get out there? When you need to wait for your manure application timing so that you know the agronomics on those fields? These are probably the three that are most affected by what you do on your field, your various activities and how it affects things. And then as I mentioned, the soil moisture part of things too, and the soil moisture obviously is going to vary throughout the year, but it's great if you can learn how to quickly do this, kind of go out and take a handful and get that feel for it. And if you do it, you know, the first time you look at the chart and you try to say, well, it kind of feels like this, I guess that's, you know, 50% moisture or 75% moisture. And then once you figure that out, this is a really important characteristic for particularly manure application is what we found. So this is one of the things that drives when you can get out there, when you should or shouldn't be on your field for compaction and for runoff issues. So knowing that soil moisture is really, really important. And it's very quick and easy to do. So how do you change your soil? How does what you do affect the general characteristics? So you're starting with a clay or a silt or a sandy type of soil, and it comes with inherent characteristics, as we know. But then what you do to it can also either make that better or potentially make it worse. And there's a lot of things that will affect that crop type. If you've got corn with a cover crop or grass or another crop, what is your field activity and practices? In other words, what type of equipment are you using out there? How often are you making passes over that field? What type of manure application equipment are you using? Are you grazing, and when is that happening and how often? Your tillage practices, so are you tilling that field up? Are you overseeding? Are you drill seeding? All those things make a difference. Your animal traffic and vehicle traffic exclusion, are you practicing that throughout the year? Your manure application, what type of equipment and how often are you doing that? Wildlife control, there's not much you can do about the wildlife. This time of year the birds really get out on your fields, but sometimes planting a really thick cover crop will actually kind of get them away. Sometimes it attracts them. It really depends, or how well you harvest the grain off of that field will sometimes keep them away. So that one's a little bit harder to change, but beaver in their dams and everything else, flooding fields, drainage, so keeping those ditches and tiles and everything else running and smooth and great. All of these things will affect your soil. And the one thing that makes the biggest difference of all of these things, and one thing they have in common, is that compaction issues. So that's obviously, the more you're on that field, the more you do to it, it's that compaction that has the greatest influence on that topsoil and how well you're going to have infiltration and permeability or runoff issues. So that's kind of your number one concern when you're looking at all of these things. And because we get so much rain here in our region, and you add that rain to that soil, and then you add pressure to that, you're really creating an environment where that compaction can really start building up and get really severe. So that's something that you always want to be thinking of when you're doing activity on your field. So let's look at some of these different variabilities, and these you'll find in that handout that's on your desk, so you can look at them now or later, and we'll kind of go through all of these various ones. And so the soil structure is the first one, and this is actually a really neat representation here, and something that you can do. Go out and any one of your fields in a representative spot, just take kind of a block of it, or a slab of this about 1 foot or 2 feet down, and then you can kind of play with these things and look at all these different parameters. But essentially, Each one of these kind of graphs or pictures will show good condition, moderate condition, and poor condition. And what you're seeing here is that a good conditioned soil is very granular. It falls apart essentially when you let it separate out. You don't have a lot of these big clods. You don't have kind of that measure of compaction essentially. So those clouds represent that soil doesn't have aeration in that area. It's kind of stuck together. It's really dense. You're not getting that airflow and porosity through there. This represents that this soil definitely has a lot more ability for infiltration through there and porosity and a lot more probably biological activity. And this is kind of a moderate soil. So to do this, and it kind of explains it a little bit in that handout, how to actually measure these things by taking that clod and then breaking it up and seeing how it kind of varies out. And you'll see different under kind of forage conditions versus an annual cropping condition. So you'll find a little bit different profiles, but it's essentially similar. And what this does is the soil structure and how it kind of lays out. If it's very kind of loose or if it's very cloddy and tight, it's going to regulate your infiltration, your aeration, your soil temperature. That's a very important one. If you have a lot of the air that's able to kind of percolate through, you can get a warming or a cooling of that soil a little bit sooner or later. Your root penetration, you definitely want your roots to be able to get as deep as possible, and maturity of your plant is will kind of have a longer longevity with a bigger root system. Whereas here, if you've got clods, it's going to have a lot harder time getting its roots down there. And we'll look at that a little bit further detail in a little minute here. Your nutrient supply as well. When you've got that aeration and you've got more infiltration and that better water in there, then your nutrient conversion, the nitrogen cycle, it happens a lot easier, and your availability to plants is going to be greater, as is your resistance to compaction. So this allows that soil structure to actually kind of resist being kind of clawed together, whereas here it's already happening, and then those pieces kind of start compacting easier and easier. So a lot to that soil structure and what it looks like, and this is a pretty easy thing to evaluate, and it'll give you right up how well is my soil, how good of a job am I doing. So by taking half an hour or so to do all these assessments on one of your fields, you can get a really good idea about what's your starting point with these things. The next one would be soil porosity. And you can see by taking a chunk, this is kind of that clod-like structure, so you're not going to have a lot of porosity through there. Whereas here, you can really see it's really loose. You have a lot of porosity. Water can really move through there very easily. And it can get through into the, through that soil profile and into the ground. So it's not sitting on top and ponding, and it's not running off. It's able to get in where the roots of the plants need it, and that water can definitely hold it, or that the soil structure can definitely hold that water. When you've got these clods, that water, you're going to have larger fissures in there, and the water can actually just flow through, and it's not able to be held by the soil and available for plants when they need it. So this is definitely a more positive soil structure for porosity. And it influences the movement of air and water in the soil, as I mentioned. And poor structure, so if we're on this clod part here, what that essentially means is you've got reduced drainage and aeration. So you would know that right off the bat. And that leads to a lot of things. It reduces the plant's ability to take up water and nutrients. The roots are unable to penetrate through there and grow very well, so this is going to stunt your plant growth. It's going to increase the susceptibility of plants to disease as well. So when that root system is all stuck at the top and it's really kind of stuck together and it can't get through that soil, it can't get what it needs, it's always going to be a little bit more stressed out. So this might be a direct relation to your actual plant growth on your field. If you're like, man, this field never does as well as this field over here. And if they're the same soil type, you can probably guess maybe it's what's happened on that field, and the structure of that soil has been compromised, and those plants can't get in there. Those root systems can't get down and get the nutrients and water they need, which means it's just being lost. So you have to put more fertilizer on there or more manure on there in order for those plants to get the nutrients they need if it's being lost to that profile, and then that leads to a whole host of other issues. So you can see by increasing that soil porosity, it increases a lot of things for your benefit. An interesting one here too, so something called soil modals, and these are basically patches of different colors, and you'll see orange is kind of a change in from iron as it starts oxidizing into the gray color, and you'll see this in soils that have been either waterlogged for too long, where you have a high water table, or you have ponding, or it's just sitting in there. You can't get the water through because you don't have a good infiltration rate. So a normal soil will be nice and brown. You may see a little bit of spotting, that's okay. But as you get more and more of that, this is what you see, and that's basically just a saturated soil. And your plants are not going to be happy. You're going to have very poor oxygenation in that soil. And you'll find these either in patches in your field, you'll find them with certain soil types, but if you ever find that, you know you need to work on your drainage for the most part. So that essentially will reduce the rooting depth. Obviously, roots don't want to go somewhere where there's no oxygen and it's saturated. It's obviously reduced uptake of water and nutrients, and you can have root rot and kill. So your winter survivability of a crop is not going to be very good if you've got a soil that saturates like that. In our area, the water table, it's okay if you have a high water table, because mostly throughout the year that comes up and down, but that's really kind of dependent on how well your drainage system is set up. So if you've got ditches around that you've just got natural drainage and they're always blocked up, why is that? So you may need to work on the drainage upstream or downstream of you in order to correct some of these issues, or look at your tile system and how well that's working. So this is really a good indicator of that. How well are things? Is my field wet too long throughout the year, and that's why it never looks great, or even though that's been in forage forever, I never get great quality? Maybe this is one of those reasons. Soil color is kind of a general indicator. The darker your soil color, the more organic matter is likely in there versus a really light type of a soil color. So this is just kind of a visual overall indicator of soil health. You can just look at that and say, wow, I've got this great dark soil, it smells really rich. You're probably doing a great job on your fertilization of that soil and your practices. Versus if it's really light colored and blocky, and maybe it smells really kind of off. And that smell, by the way, if you go back and you've got one of these mottled soils that's kind of that grayish color, they usually smell really awful. And so that's also an indicator of that prolonged saturation, and maybe your organic matter is not as good in that soil. So that dark color is an indicator of good infiltration, good movement and retention of water is needed, a stable soil structure, and an increased nutrient uptake potential by that crop, just by looking at the color. Earthworms is another great one. So when you take up that soil chunk that you've got, if you pull it up and you see 0 earthworms, that is a good indicator that the biological activity in your soil is probably reduced. So these guys are a really great indicator of your soil health. And you'll look at it through that soil profile. How many worms do you have? And sometimes you'll hit, if the water table comes up a lot, you'll kind of hit a pan where certain times of the year maybe you won't see them, but they'll be in that upper part. And even if you've got a ponded area per se, and you dig it up and you've got a lot of worms, you do have some good health in there. Maybe you just have a surface compaction issue that you can work on by planting a cover crop. So even though you may see some indicators that aren't great, if you see a lot of worms, this is a really good indicator, because these guys improve all sorts of things: soil porosity and aeration and water infiltration, your drainage rate, your root density. Worms actually are a source of fertilizer, if you will. There's a lot of castings from them, and they eat up to 2 tons of dry matter per acre per year, and they process that right through and create this really rich soil profile. So worms are great. So even when they die in the soil, they really retain and provide a lot of carbon for your soil structure and for those plants. They're a soil biological activity indicator, essentially. So you want lots of worms. Another one, so surface ponding, and it's going to be pretty similar if we look at it on forage and or on corn. So surface ponding essentially is just an indicator that you've got compaction on that field, or you've got a high water table. And how long that lasts will tell you kind of which one it is. So if you've got a high water table in that area and you've got another indicator that shows that that's equal, then that's probably what it is, and there's not a lot you can do about that. However, if you've got this standing water on your field and the ditches nearby have gone down and that water's still there, you probably have a compaction issue. So you can kind of look at those two things, which is it? And this will create a lot of issues, as we've already kind of mentioned, some of these root stress and rot. And this is a huge issue right now in the spring when your plants are trying to really get going. You want that first cutting early. Your plants are trying to grow and get their things going. And if they're just sitting in water, there's no aeration in that soil. They can't get their roots down. And so your yields are going to be a little bit less. So if you've got a field where your forage height is just not quite there and you've got a field where it's just awesome, it probably has something to do maybe with a water table or a ponding issue. If you've also got a ponding indicator on that low quality field, then you can look into that. Is it something you just can't do much about? Maybe that's not the right crop for that field. Kind of looking at those things. And it also indicates a nutrient deficiency because you're going to have a lot of that nitrogen. Instead of going to nitrate in an arid environment with oxygen, you're going to denitrify that and lose it as nitrogen gas in the atmosphere when you go into an anoxic or a no oxygen environment. So that makes a really big difference on what type and how much nitrogen you're going to have available for your plant when it needs it. Corn would be a similar idea. So this is just an indicator of compaction or high water table. Most of the time it's compaction, particularly when you don't have a cover crop on there. So you're on those fields. A lot of corn fields tend to be in kind of those like silty clay type soils because that's the crop that's usually chosen for that, for a lot of rotations. And so this is very easy, as I mentioned, to compact those soils and to see this standing water here. And while you're probably just going to till it all up, put manure and put more corn on there, you're still breaking down your soil every time you do that. And you can improve it for your next corn crop by having some other cover on here, like a cover crop, which acts with those root systems to bring that down, increasing your infiltration, increasing some of the beneficial factors here. You're going to have less loss of sediment off of this. So sediment is going to go into that ditch nearby, back it up, and now you've got high water table issues. So some of these things, even though you may say, well, it doesn't matter what my corn fields look like in the wintertime, I'm not worried about it, they're actually contributing to the health and benefit of all the other fields nearby in a lot of cases. So it is an important thing to look at. And you're also going to have a delay in your field work if it's really wet. And that's not something you want around here. You need every day possible in order to get out there and warm up that soil and get your corn out. So that makes a really big difference. Color and growth for forage, this is a visual indicator. So we've kind of moved from those looking at your actual soil to looking at what's happening on top, right, with the ponding, etc. And this is one that you can look at it from color. And these pictures are from a pasture environment where you'll see like urine patches, essentially is what this is. But nonetheless, even on your grass fields, you can have a color indicator as a nutrient deficiency or over nutrients in some cases. So is it yellow, is it green, what color, do you have a mix of color out there? Same with your corn, you can look at it, you know, the purple colors, red colors, greens, etc. to know basically what is your nutrient deficiencies out there. But one thing that you can tie that back to, instead of saying, well, I should put more manure out there, in some cases you're having a color issue because there's too much out there, because your soil health isn't good enough to provide and convert when it needs it, how it needs it. So go all the way back to what is actually my soil. Are there other indicators that I can look at to improve my soil health such that my crop color is going to change naturally when I provide what's needed in the soil? So this can actually, color can actually indicate that nutritional status, the nitrogen cycle of the soil, and if you're actually over applying manure. So that's actually kind of a detriment there. If you can get that, if it's saturation or permeability or compaction, if you can reduce all those issues, that nitrogen cycles can be more active, the conversions can be better when your plant needs it, and your manure application, you'll have less of it potentially, or just better is what it'll be more, and the conversion and uptake will be better and your crop yields will improve. Forage density is also a really important thing. It's an indicator of soil health and production. So you've got a nice dense stand of forage. That means your soil's probably very happy. It's not having big saturation or compaction issues. Things are looking really good. If you've got these types of issues happening, you've got a lot of dead spots, or you've got super saturation in mossy areas, you want to just look at some of those other issues that are potentially happening. If you don't have a high water table and no saturation and you're still having a lot of kill, you can look at, well, I wonder if was it a winter kill issue, in which case did you apply manure too late and it went into forage rather than roots, or was it that you're just getting killed because for some reason, you know, that rooting depth isn't very low. If you dig up a clod and you say, wow, my roots are only a few inches, they should be feet, then you can say, wow, the soil structure is also really tight. Maybe I need to work on this field a little bit with X, Y, or Z type of practices. So this should not be happening in most cases. Sometimes it's just time to replant a field, but technically if you're really good soil health and you've managed that really well, you should have longevity in your forage fields for a very, very long time. So that relates here to that rooting length and density. So you can, if you pull up a clod and you shake kind of the dirt off of the top kind of forage rooting part, you should have a lot of long, dense roots. This is what we actually oftentimes see, is just these kind of sparse roots. How far? This is about a foot of soil or so. Maybe they kind of end right about there. And that's going to relate back to that forage density. So these things obviously are going to be pretty well related. And these things obviously are an indicator of your overall soil quality and what's happening out there. And if you can get this nice deep root system, you're going to have better resiliency and winter survivability of that crop. You're going to have more or less reliance on manure, or chemical fertilizer, and having to extra and supplement and trying to boost your yields. And really, it's like plants on steroids, right? That's just not sustainable. You want them to actually just have good nutrition so they're healthy and they'll actually grow even better. So you want to maximize your manure by having good soil quality. You're going to have less leaching and runoff losses with this root structure because it will create that nice permeability, breaks up that soil, keeps it kind of like a nice big sponge instead of tight clods where you just can't get the roots through. So the water is going to go through there really nicely and it's going to be retained. So you'll have less irrigation, or you'll have better timed irrigation practices in the summer as well. And that's a really nice benefit. Hard pan relates to that. So the hard pan will let you know what is the potential rooting depth for that. So is it nice and loose? Where's that hard pan? As you look at some of these soils that I brought here, you can see that as we dug them up, there's that top foot on some of these that is just hard. And then after that, it starts breaking up. But if your roots can't get through that top 6 inches or a foot, doesn't matter how good it is below that. So you want to make sure that that top part, how deep is that hard pan? Is it just a little bit? How deep? And where is that? Where is the root structure, in other words, going to have the hardest time breaking through and getting to that? And that's where you need to focus your efforts. So a strong hard pan, so in other words, this kind of cloddy, not great soil, that's going to be less rooting depth, lower yields, less resiliency of that crop, and a greater runoff potential because the water can't get through, it's going to go off. And you're going to have later timing on being able to get out to that field in the springtime. So what can you do to actually improve that soil? So we've talked about all these different indicators, and you've kind of got all that information here. And so now, how do you actually improve that? So some of the things you can do, as I mentioned this like 8 times, cover crops are a really great way to improve your soil. And you can either leave your field out like this, and this is just, is this ponding because it's a high water table here, or is it because there is compaction there and there's nothing, there's no kind of wintertime or other time root structure that's helping break up that top layer and allowing that water to infiltrate down to the level where it can finally get off of that field. So now you're waiting to get out on this field longer and longer, or you just get out there and you get your tractor stuck and everything else. So that's not what you want. Having a nice cover crop is going to, even though there may be a little bit of water on here, it's definitely staying there, or it's getting in. It's definitely going to infiltrate sooner than this field is in the springtime when conditions are improving and when you want to get out there. So that's a real benefit. Harvesting that crop also gives you an entire another at least ton of feed, if not more, that you can harvest and have that, and that's a really huge economic benefit for a relatively inexpensive practice to get on. Another one is just your crop rotation. So as I mentioned, if you can allow your forage fields, if you've got a healthy stand of soil in there, and sometimes it's hard to get that going, but if you can leave that forage in forage, you're going to have a greater maturity, which means hopefully a much larger rooting depth, a much denser rooting depth, more worms can establish themselves in there if you're not tilling it up and changing it every couple of years. And if you can leave that, you're really going to have huge benefits to your soil over time. It may take a few years before you really see this. That process is slow in soil, but you'll see it. And you can have these forage fields stay for a long time, not just 3 or 4 years, 10 years plus. And there's a lot of those around here that have done really well. And if you're starting to see a real decrease, maybe you have a grazing operation and that grazing, your timing is just not right, so they're really destroying that top layer. If you've actually spent the time to have that mature field underneath, it's still going to be okay, and it's just getting them off and reestablishing that nice stand of grass for a couple of years, and then you're going to have a return of that health there. So sometimes it's just changing up what you do a little bit in order to get that stand looking good. And then, of course, corn is not a great idea either. So obviously, if you've got corn, you're rotating that into grass every few years just to help kind of break that back up. So that's a really common practice, and that's good. And then also having the cover crop in there is going to help increase that and keep your soil structure going a lot longer, such that when it does go back into grass, that grass is going to be really productive instead of mildly productive for a few years. So you're going to increase your rooting depth, soil health, infiltration rate, organic matter by having more of that carbon source and organic matter out there, and the overall soil biology. And that's going to be better for every crop that goes on any of your soils or fields. So tillage, there's different things you can do here, and no-till is not very common here, but no-till as a practice, actually you're not breaking up those clods. So when you till, even though you're thinking, well, I'm getting in there and I'm fluffing up that soil and aerating it and all that, you're actually breaking down that soil every single time. And the more you do that, the finer it gets, and then the more apt it is actually to clod. So sometimes tillage is not a good thing, which is why rotating it back into grass sometimes helps when you've got a corn rotation. But also if you're going to plant your cover crop, doing kind of an overseeding, if you're doing a relay or a cover crop and overseeding versus the till, you can kind of get a more, instead of just having that crop in the row, you can kind of get it everywhere, and that's going to help break up that soil as well. So that's going to reduce the compaction rates and improve your infiltration rate a lot during the wet times of the year. Traffic exclusion, obviously, so keeping animals and traffic off of that field when it's really wet, that's the best way, obviously, to reduce compaction, and it's the way that it usually happens. So you can create drive lanes, so field borders that do have a perennial stand of grass on them, such that there's always something kind of breaking up in there, and maybe that area is going to be a lot drier as a drive than it is over here where you've got corn or something else, where those are typically very wet and you've got a lot of compaction issues happening. So as well, another one is kind of better timing. Obviously, manure application, you don't want to be out there when it's wet. But what type of equipment are you using when you're applying manure? Are you using a big gun which has low compaction but some other issues related that you need to be careful of? Or are you using kind of a big tired tractor when you get out there, in which case you can probably, if you can drive a tractor on your field, it's probably dry enough, but it's always good to evaluate that soil moisture to know that, so you're not going to have a compaction issue. You can always use sacrifice lane, so always have the same pull lane. So if you are going to have an area that's going to be compacted, just dedicate it to one strip rather than moving that compaction line all over the place. This doesn't always work in all areas, but it has the potential. So this traffic exclusion, that's your number one for reducing compaction, which is our major issue for that top layer of soil. So you're going to have reduction of ponding issues and better infiltration rate, aeration, and plant nutrient conversion overall. Drainage, as well as I kind of mentioned this. So maintain your drainage, and we had a great talk about this a couple months ago about how to do that. So if you can keep your drainage moving, and you can do this by, instead of having bare field in a drainage, if you've got grass or a cover crop on that corn, then you're going to have less sediment delivery into that waterway, and that's a real positive. Keep an eye on your tiles and what's coming in there, what's going out of there, keeping up that drainage so that you don't have kind of low spots. If you do have a high water table, which you can't really do anything about, you can at least make sure that that drainage structure that's around it is functioning as best as possible, so that when that water table kind of fluctuates up and down, your field can actually respond very quickly to that, and that will help maintain a good root structure, and it won't kind of saturate and kill everything out as quickly. So definitely an important thing to do. Leveling fields and filling in low spots. Why, you always have just like one little low spot in a field, and why? If you could actually fix that, working with your plan and an engineer or whatever is necessary to do that correctly, you can actually reduce having that low spot and the overall kind of issue related to that in your field. And then manure application, so using, as we mentioned, the appropriate equipment for soil type, for crop, and for that time of year. This will have a ton of benefits to it. So you're going to reduce your compaction, reducing runoff, that's obviously very important. Increasing your nutrient conversion rate. So if you're applying on a saturated field, you're going to lose all that nitrogen most likely if it's just denitrifying and going up as nitrogen gas, versus you've got some infiltration and room in that soil for that nutrient to get in there and to convert to a usable form of nitrogen that your plants can take up right when they need it. So that's also really important. Feed quality as well. So if you can't get on your field early and you just get out there not long before first cutting, you just dump as much nitrogen as you can because you think you want to catch up, all that nitrate is going to be taken up by your feed. You're going to have high nitrates in your feed on that first cutting, and that's really detrimental to your cow's health. So you really want to watch out. If you can get out there earlier and split those applications, you're probably going to have a more reliant and better nitrate quality to your feed. So you're not going to have those cow issue or health issues that you may see. That's a really big one. And then overall kind of yields and feed quality. If you can get out early and split, and you can get the water off of there, you're going to have a way better first cutting, and you can get up to 40% better cuttings by being able to do that. We've done some trials on fields that show that, on forage fields. So, and same with your corn as well. That kind of, this is mostly more related to your forage fields, etc., but your corn is the same. Like, are you getting out there right before planting because you couldn't get out there earlier, or do you get out and then you have to wait and then you've kind of lost all that manure? So being able to time when your manure gets out on your corn as well, when you're kind of working up that field, and when that goes out, just as important. And that relates to your soil health and structure and that water infiltration as well. So kind of just a summary of those things. As I mentioned, the things you can do that relate to many of these good soil health practices are just decreasing compaction, increasing your overall organic matter on that field. And that's basically with good practices, with good manure application, at agronomic rates as your field and your plants and your water logging and everything else is going to allow. And that organic matter, if you've got a poor quality soil, like technically when you look at that graph, you're saying, oh, I've got a clay-based soil. But if you can get manure out there and the right type of manure, kind of that thicker stuff with a lot of organic matter over time, that's going to really add to the soil quality. You're going to have better water kind of holding capacity in there when you need it. You're going to have better infiltration. It kind of breaks up that soil. So you can improve your soil with manure, absolutely. It's one of the better things you have on your farm. Planting the cover crops on cornfields has a huge benefit overall to your soil health, your future crop rotation longevity, and your water infiltration and retention on that field. Maintaining those forage fields, that's mainly by maintaining that soil structure to what you do, and when you're fertilizing and all those pieces, the healthier that forage field, the longer you can leave it, the less you have to be tilling it and replanting and all that. It's going to save a lot of money in the long run on that field. Not over-fertilizing. If you over-fertilize, as I mentioned, that's kind of like steroids to your grass and your farm. And not only is it going to decrease your forage quality, your plants become reliant on it, and then they can't really get that rooting structure. And so those two things are connected. If you have poor soil quality, they need that. Improve your soil quality, you're going to have better timed and better utilized nutrients overall. And so overall, kind of that economics and improve crop yields, it's huge in the long run if you can really manage your soil right and get things in that quality up by just thinking about doing that little visual assessment, looking at these, just taking a little time to do those pieces and saying, wow, you know, I did this and I realize I have, you know, this problem. Everything looks good on the color and the smell, but for some reason I really have all these ponding issues. Maybe you just have a top level issue, and look at your practices. When are you getting out there? How are you doing those things? And just say, well, if I just adjust this timing, I may be able to improve that. Try it out and see if it works. And if you can improve just one or two of your practices, you may improve all of your overall soil health, and you'd had no idea until you really started to look at these things. So if you've got fields that are very good quality, figure out why. If you've got fields that are very poor quality, figure out why, and then you can kind of swap what are you doing good on that one field and improve all your fields in that respect. So it makes a really big difference in the long run. So with that, I can take some questions if you have them. And again, kind of looking at some of these soils, and I'll just kind of point out what we have here. So the one in this box, and I would actually encourage you to lift this one up compared to the other ones. So this is a cornfield. It's kind of a clay silt-based soil. And the one in this box, and I'll just put it next to it, is the exact same soil type, the exact same amount of soil, but it's a grass. So this one is in forage. And this one, I swear, is like 3 times heavier because it's completely compacted. There's no cover crop on this one, nothing there. And it shows. It's a big difference. And you can look at the size of the clod here and then what it looks like as it kind of goes down the profile, and the same on this one and what that looks like. This is a cornfield that had a cover crop, and this is a very well managed field. And you can see that in the soil structure and the quality and the color, and you can kind of feel it. And these were all taken today, so they're all the same kind of weather that they've had on them, the same rain as of late, so the moisture, etc. And this one had a lot of ponding on it, this one had none. And this is just a little bit different soil type. You can feel it, it has a little bit more silt in it, so that makes a difference. But definitely what made the biggest difference was how this one was treated with the cover crop. So I'd encourage you to come over and kind of feel each one of these, and there's a sink in the back if you want to wash your hands afterwards. But kind of look at those as well. So this one, I left this so you know it was actually the cover crop one, and this one's the forage one.